If you ask anyone in the United States what comes to mind when they hear the name Costa Rica, they'll tell you about paradise, ecotourism, pristine beaches, deep, vibrant rainforests, the national motto, Pura Vida, pure life. It is a nation that abolished its army in 1948, a beacon of peace in Central America, a region historically torn apart by civil wars, dictatorships, and political violence. For decades, Costa Rica stood alone as the exception, a safe haven, a place where the monsters of the world simply didn't exist. But every paradise has its shadows. In the mid-1980s, the illusion of absolute safety in this peaceful country was shattered. The threat didn't come from a foreign military. It didn't come from a political uprising. It came from the dark corners of their own streets, from the isolated roads, from the thick, unlit coffee plantations south of the capital. It came in the form of a lone, methodical predator, a phantom who hunted in the dark, plunging a nation into a decade of chronic terror. They had never seen anything like him before, and because of that, they didn't know how to stop him. To understand the sheer panic that gripped Costa Rica in the 1980s and 90s, you have to understand the country at that time. This was a society built on trust. People left their doors unlocked. It was entirely normal for teenagers and young couples to drive out to the rural edges of the city, parking their cars in the dark, isolated coffee plantations for romantic evenings. The concept of a serial killer was something Costa Ricans only experienced by watching American movies. It was a foreign concept, a distant nightmare. But that innocence was about to end, and it ended with an event so brutal. It is still considered one of the darkest days in the country's history. April 6, 1986, Palm Sunday, in the town of Alajuelita, just south of San Jose, there is a massive iron cross at the top of the San Miguel Mountain. Every year, thousands of Catholics make the pilgrimage up that mountain on this day. Families, children, elderly couples who have walked that same path for decades. The atmosphere was festive, peaceful, entirely devoid of security. No one thought they needed it. Among the crowd was a family group, a 41-year-old mother named Esther, her 3 teenage and preteen daughters, and her 3 young nieces, 7 women, 6 of them, just children. The youngest was only 4 years old. They walked up the mountain path together, in the warmth of a Costa Rican spring morning, surrounded by thousands of other families doing exactly the same thing. They never came home. The next morning, while the media was already broadcasting missing persons alerts, a local farmer named Teodoro Corretana was walking near the trails. In an area known as La Granadilla, hidden among the dense vegetation and the uneven terrain, he found them. The scene was something out of a nightmare. The bodies were divided into 2 groups, 2 at the base of a banana tree, the other 5 lined up inside a small depression in the earth. The first officers to arrive noted something incredibly chilling. The bodies were arranged so neatly, so methodically, that from a distance, it looked like they were just sleeping. But they weren't. Every single one of the 7 victims had been shot in the head. It was a precise, calculated, execution-style massacre. The shockwave was immediate and absolute. The Judicial Investigation Organism, known as the OIJ, was thrust into a logistical nightmare. This was 1986. DNA profiling wasn't available in Costa Rica. The OIJ didn't have the scientific preparation, the training, or the experience to handle a mass execution in an open, outdoor environment. The crime scene was contaminated. Crucial forensic protocols were bypassed in the chaos. The public pressure was suffocating. Everyone demanded answers immediately. And when authorities are desperate for answers, they tend to find them, even if they're the wrong ones. The police arrested 4 local men, known gang members with ties to the underworld. Their street names were plastered across every newspaper: Trace Pellos, Arnoldillo, Galetta, and Veruda. The authorities presented them as the definitive culprits. But behind closed doors, things weren't adding up. The families of the victims didn't believe the official story. They suspected a targeted hit, a revenge killing connected to organized crime. The criminal underworld, however, had its own way of dealing with the situation. Before the men could face a proper trial, the streets began to erase them. Veruda was lured into an ambush and stabbed to death. Goleta, heavily intoxicated and deeply disturbed, reportedly told his nephew that he was so evil not even the devil wanted him, before playing Russian roulette and putting a bullet in his own head. Tres Pellos was shot directly in the face. He survived. By 1992, the surviving suspects were officially acquitted. The evidence had been entirely circumstantial. They were the wrong men, and the police knew it, because the real killer had already told them. While the 4 gang members sat in jail, the ballistic experts made a terrifying discovery. The bullets pulled from the victims at Alajuelita weren't fired from standard handgun. They came from a heavy, military-grade weapon, an M3 submachine gun, commonly known as a grease gun, firing heavy .45 ACP ammunition. This was a weapon of war, incredibly rare in civilian Costa Rica, difficult to conceal. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was someone with extreme tactical confidence. But the weapon wasn't the most disturbing part. It was what the killer did with it. The head of the homicide division, Gerardo Lascares, realized that the killer was leaving a psychological signature at every single crime scene. He deliberately left the spent shell casings behind. In the language of criminal profiling, this is an act of communication. He wasn't making a mistake. He was taunting them. He was telling the police, "You have the wrong men in jail. I'm still out here." The M3 became his signature, and soon, he began to use it again. The killer established a strict hunting ground. The press would later call it the Triangle of Death. He operated almost exclusively south of the Florencio del Castillo Highway. Dense coffee plantations, abandoned lots, dark, isolated roads where the city lights didn't reach. At night, those plantations are pitch black, silent. They offered endless cover to stalk a target, and multiple escape routes back into the urban sprawl. Now, this is where the story becomes difficult to tell, because what the investigators eventually reconstructed, through forensic evidence, through ballistics, and through the testimonies of those who survived, painted a portrait of someone methodical, controlled, patient in a way that defied comprehension. There is a particular kind of fear that settles into a society when it realizes the monster is not a stranger. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. Witnesses who survived early encounters described the same sequence with almost identical precision. He would emerge from the darkness of the plantation, calm, the M3 already raised, as if he had been standing there for a very long time, waiting. One survivor described the moment he appeared as almost surreal. It didn't feel like an attack, she later told investigators. It felt like he had been expecting us. He spoke quietly. He gave instructions. He was in complete control from the first second. With couples, the sequence never varied. The man was neutralized first. Always. Immediately. Not out of rage. Out of logistics. The male victim was simply an obstacle to be removed. Investigators noted that in several crime scenes, the male victim's body was found significantly further from the road than the woman's. He made them walk, together, into the dark, and then, at a distance he had clearly calculated in advance, he fired. What happened after that is where the police reports become difficult to read. The word the investigators used repeatedly in official documents was barbarities. Barbarities, a deliberate, sanitized choice of language. A way of acknowledging the severity of what occurred without fully describing it. What the forensic evidence confirmed was this. The women did not die quickly. There was a prolonged period between the execution of their companion and their own death. The killer was in a location he knew intimately, in complete darkness, with no witnesses. He had all the time in the world, and he used it. Between 1986 and 1996, the killer struck again and again. December 1986, a young couple ambushed in the darkness south of San Jose. February 1987, another couple, another night, another set of shell casings left behind. But there was one case among all the others that the investigators couldn't set aside. One case that, even decades later, those who worked it still talk about in hushed voices. August 1988. Victor Julio Hernandez was 18 years old. He worked at a small business near his neighborhood in the southern part of San Jose. By all accounts, he was a quiet young man, responsible, the kind of person who called his mother when he was going to be late. Aracelly was 15. She was still in school. She loved music. Her family described her as the kind of girl who filled a room just by walking into it. She and Victor had been together for nearly 2 years. In the way that young people sometimes do, they had already started talking about the future, about what came next. They were engaged to be married. On the night of August 12th, 1988, Victor and Aracelly parked their car on a desolate street on the southern edge of the city. It was a Tuesday night. They weren't doing anything unusual. They were just two young people in a parked car talking about their future together, until the man with the M3 stepped out of the shadows. The shell casings found at the scene the next morning matched the same weapon from Alajuelita, from a 1986 couple's, from every other unsolved murder in the Triangle of Death. Victor was 18. Aracelly was 15. They were supposed to get married, but amidst this terrifying pattern, there was one case that shook the investigators more than any other. One case that proved the killer was capable of something far more calculated than they had imagined. June 14th, 1987, Legia Camacho Bermudez was not parked in a coffee plantation. She wasn't walking alone at night. She wasn't in the Triangle of Death. She was in her own home, lying in her bed, in the early hours of the morning, quietly reading a book. Outside her window, the killer was waiting in the dark. He had tracked her. He had stalked her to her private residence. He stood outside the glass, raised the submachine gun, and fired a single, fatal shot directly into her head. When the ballistics came back, it was the M3. This terrified the profilers. It meant the killer wasn't just an opportunist who targeted vulnerable people in isolated locations. He was capable of complex, premeditated stalking. He could identify a target, follow her, learn her routines, find out where she lived. The psychological boundary of safety had vanished entirely. Nowhere was safe. The press went into a frenzy. By 1989, the streets had given the monster a name, and the name stuck so hard that every major newspaper in the country eventually had to adopt it. They called him El Psicopata, the psychopath. With the public in a state of panic, the OIJ brought in forensic psychiatrists and criminal profilers for the first time in the country's history. What they concluded was deeply unsettling. They determined they were looking for what they described as a successful psychopath. Unlike disorganized killers who are caught quickly because of erratic, impulsive behavior, a successful psychopath is charming, organized, invisible. This man wasn't a raving lunatic hiding in a cave. He was highly functional. He likely held a steady job. He probably had a family, a wife, children, neighbors who waved at him in the morning and thought nothing of it. He had the ability to completely disassociate, meaning he could do what he did in those coffee plantations at 2 a.m. and sit down for a perfectly normal breakfast with his family at 7 a.m. The profilers also noted something that created a massive operational problem for the police: his cooling off periods. After each attack, the killer would go completely silent. Months would pass, sometimes over a year. During those silences, the police would build a special task force, assign investigators, dedicate resources. But as months passed with no new bodies, the pressure of daily crime would force the department to dismantle the task force. The investigators would be reassigned. The institutional knowledge would scatter. And then, when the tension inside the killer finally boiled over again, the police had to start completely from scratch. New detectives, no memory of the previous cases, no continuity. He was always one step ahead. Now, here is something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about this case. The impact on Costa Rican society was not just psychological. It was physical. It was behavioral. It rewrote the unwritten rules of daily life in a country that had never needed those rules before. Businesses in the southern zones of San Jose began closing earlier. Streets that had been lively on weekend nights became empty by 9 o'clock. Parents who had grown up in a country where leaving your door unlocked was normal now installed locks, then deadbolts, then iron bars on their windows. The coffee plantation roads, which had been a traditional meeting point for young couples for generations, became genuinely feared. Couples who had parked in those areas for years suddenly stopped, not because anyone told them to, but because everyone knew someone who had been in the wrong place. Schools began incorporating safety warnings into their curricula. Teachers told students explicitly, do not go to isolated areas at night. Do not park near the plantations. Do not walk alone after dark. An entire generation of Costa Ricans came of age under this shadow, and the killer fed on that fear. Profilers noted that as the public panic grew, his cooling-off periods became shorter. The coverage, the terror, the constant media attention, it stimulated him. The country's fear was not a deterrent. It was a reward. The hunt dragged on for an entire decade. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the phantom vanished. October 26, 1996. The rural area of Patara, on the southern edge of the city. Mauricio Cordero and Ileana Alvarez were sitting in their car. A familiar evening. A familiar location. They had no reason to believe that night would be any different from any other. The familiar nightmare unfolded. The man with the M3 appeared. He forced them out of the car at gunpoint. He made them walk nearly a kilometer into the absolute darkness of the terrain, completely isolated. He executed both of them. It was, by the official count, his 19th and final confirmed killing. In a detail that captured the complete dysfunction of the investigation, it wasn't the police who found the bodies. Journalists from Diario Extra went out into the plantations themselves, swept the area, and found Mauricio and Ileana. The press had to do the job that law enforcement couldn't. But after those 2 shots in Patara, the M3 went silent. It never fired again. He stopped. And when a serial killer simply stops, without being caught, without dying, without explanation, the human mind refuses to accept coincidence. People need answers. And in the absence of truth, conspiracies thrive. How does a man operate for 10 years in a small country where everyone knows everyone, using a heavy military weapon, killing at least 19 people, and remain completely invisible? For many Costa Ricans, the answer was not incompetence. It was protection. To understand why that theory resonated so deeply, you have to understand what the name Figueres meant in Costa Rica, not just as a political family, but as a foundation. Jose Figueres Ferrer was not simply a former president. He was the architect of the country itself. In 1948, he led a revolution, won a civil war in 44 days, and then did something almost unprecedented in the history of Central America. He abolished the army, completely, permanently. He handed the military barracks over to the Ministry of Education. He gave women and Afro-Costa Ricans the right to vote. He nationalized the banking system. He served as president 3 separate times, 1948, 1953, and again in 1970. In Costa Rica, Jose Figueres Ferrer is not a historical figure the way other presidents are historical figures. He is the origin story. His son, Jose Maria Figueres Olson, carried that legacy directly into the years of the killings. He served as Minister of Agriculture and then Minister of Foreign Trade during the late 1980s, while El Psicopata was actively hunting. In 1994, at 39 years old, he became the youngest elected president of Costa Rica in the 20th century. He governed from 1994 to 1998, the final years of the killings. And then there was the other son, Mariano Figueres Olson, quieter than his father and his brother, less visible in the public sphere, but deeply embedded in the structures of Costa Rican security and intelligence. He eventually became the director of the DES, the Dirección de Inteligencia y Seguridad, Costa Rica's national intelligence agency, the organization responsible for knowing what others don't. He died in September 2019 at 59 years old, following complications from a motorcycle accident. The street rumor that attached itself to his name was precise in its logic. It claimed that the OIJ had, in fact, identified the killer, that they had developed a strong lead, that when the investigation pointed toward a specific individual, the file was closed, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the name was too dangerous to pursue. Because arresting a member of the family that had literally constructed the Costa Rican state, the family that abolished the army, that built the schools, that defined the national identity, would not just destroy a family. It would destroy the story Costa Rica told about itself. A peaceful country. A country without an army. A country built on pura vida. That story could not survive what the truth would require. So, according to the rumor, they buried it. I want to be absolutely clear about what I just told you. There is no forensic evidence linking Mariano Figueres Olson to any of these crimes. No ballistic match, no DNA, no witness testimony, no official document. He was never formally investigated, never charged, and died in 2019 without ever being publicly accused through any official legal channel. This is a conspiracy theory. It was born from desperation. It was fed by a decade of institutional failure, and it spread through a society that had watched its government fail them repeatedly for 10 years. But here's what is not a theory. The killer was never identified. The case is legally closed forever. The most powerful family in Costa Rican history governed during the years he hunted, and the gap between what the public believed and what the state was willing to say was never closed. What you do with that is entirely up to you. The ghosts of El Psicopata haunted Costa Rica long after the killing stopped. Between 2000 and 2001, a new predator emerged in San Jose. He targeted homeless youth. He dismembered his victims. The press called him El Descuartizator, the dismemberer. Panic flared across the country. People whispered that the psychopath had returned, evolved, changed his method. The profilers disagreed. The signatures were entirely different. The choice of victim, the location, the methodology. This was a different person, a new monster. Tragically, he was never caught either. Then, in July 2005, something happened that temporarily stopped the country. Construction workers digging in a residential backyard, right in the middle of the triangle of death, hit something metal. They pulled up a rusted, heavily corroded firearm. It was an M3 submachine gun. The nation held its breath. Costa Rica is a small country. The Triangle of Death is not a large geographic area. Had the killer buried his weapon in his own hunting ground? Had he lived, or still lived, within walking distance of where he had killed? The gun was rushed to the forensic labs. The ballistics experts painstakingly compared the microstriations of the rusted barrel to the .45 caliber casings they had kept under lock and key since 1986. The results came back. It was not a match, just a cruel, macabre coincidence, the ultimate dead end. In the years following the killings, a professor at the UNED, the Universidad Estatal de Estancia, Costa Rica's national open university, conducted one of the most thorough academic investigations into the case ever undertaken. He gathered court documents, police reports, forensic analyses, and testimonies. He assembled the scattered pieces of a decade of institutional failure into a single, documented record. That research became a book, a record that the case existed, that 19 people died, that a society was changed permanently by one person who was never found. It is, in many ways, the only monument these victims have, because there is no trial, there is no conviction, there is no grave with the killer's name on it. There is only the archive, and the unanswered questions that live inside it. Today, the case of El Psicopata is legally, permanently closed. Under Costa Rican law, the statute of limitations for all 19 murders has expired. The massacre at Alajuelita prescribed in 1998. The last killings prescribed years after that. Even if the killer is still alive today, even if he is an old man, living quietly somewhere in Costa Rica or beyond its borders, even if he walked into a police station tomorrow, placed the real M3 on the desk, and handed over a detailed, DNA-verified confession, the state could not touch him. He cannot be tried. He cannot be imprisoned. The law dictates that he is a free man. He was a predator who perfectly exploited the geography of his country and the innocence of his era. He stole the lives of at least 19 people, a mother and her daughters on a mountain on Palm Sunday, a teenage couple who were supposed to get married, a woman reading quietly in her own bed, and many others whose names deserve to be spoken more than they are. He fundamentally changed how an entire generation of Costa Ricans feels about the dark, and then he faded into the mist. A phantom who proved that sometimes absolute evil doesn't face divine or earthly punishment. Sometimes it just walks away. Some stories don't have endings. They just stop being told. And this is the Jungle Files.